Well, hello. I want to go over how I've been seeing large organizations improve how they do software. And I think importantly, what they're looking at changing, how they're thinking about operating if they want to improve the way they do software. So I think this is the question that when I've talked with large organizations and see them doing well with software, this is really what those successful organizations start with. Now, they might arrive at this after doing some work and thinking about it, but this is the key question for companies nowadays who are looking to, as people often say, be more like tech companies. What they want to do is they want to figure out how to change the way they do their business by using and relying on custom written software and the ability to evolve that software quickly to really explore this question of what it is that you do with your applications that not only improve customer experience, but really create value for the business. How are you using software to accomplish the goals that your organization has? And also, I think something that's important to focus on is not only how you improve the software that you have, but how do you start to get to the point where you are fundamentally changing the business and improving the business because of your ability to do software well. Now, when it comes to improving the way that you do software and improving the way you do IT, oftentimes it seems like a daunting task. But I've just sampled some of the results that people we've worked with at VMware Tanzu have gotten over the year. And you can see arranged in two different types that there really are tangible, good results. And these are from companies of all walks of life, not just tech companies. But you can see that there are massive technical improvements that they get. So improvements in developer productivity and operational efficiency. Things like reducing incidents and making sure that your uptime is much better. But to the point of that opening question, I think it's the business improvements that I'm most interested in and that I think are the most important for how you're thinking about modernizing the way you do software. You can see that there's very tangible increases in not only revenue and more ordering, but also things like getting more customers, enrolling more, and very strategic initiatives that directly increase customer satisfaction and improve your costs, like reducing call center volume. And I'll go over a couple of these examples as we go through, but the thing I want you to realize is that change is totally possible. It may seem difficult, and when you go back and talk with your organization, and there's a lot of resistance, and you have to have a lot of meetings, and people say no, and nothing happens, and it feels a little uncomfortable to do things in a new ways, it's very much so worth it, both technically and business-wise, and it's definitely possible. There's many of your peers who are going through this and have gone through it as well. So if we just saw what's possible, the good results that people get, let's start with the baseline of what I see more commonly in organizations. So let's start with just a couple of metrics that I think demonstrate how things are out there, how most organizations are functioning that I talk with. And, some of these are what I like to think of as the three sad donuts, right? And what you see here is that despite the fact that most everyone knows, especially increasingly the business side, that they need to improve their software estate, right? They need to improve the way they're doing their software. What they encounter instead is a pretty high rate of failure, right? So if you look at over the past over 10 years of studies from this organization called the Standish Group, what they found in surveying over and over again, that is only about 30% of projects are successful. And the rest of them are either not delivered on budget or on time or are not satisfactory with the feature sets that they have. And you start to pull apart about why this is, and you can see that there are large legacy investments or technical debt holding organizations back. They're not able to move fast enough. They haven't been able to release their software very often, and this results in essentially not being able to improve your application estate, right? So if you think about it, we're at this point where your organization, your customers, or the people that you're working with really expect your software to be constantly improving, to be a way that is improving the business, and yet, for the most part, most organizations are not there. They can't really even deploy their applications rapidly enough to start incorporating in new features as users use it and kind of change the software around as needed. So this is a frustrating state for people to be in. But I think what it starts to point us towards is asking, what is a more optimal way of doing software? So how do organizations that are doing software well, that are very much so programming the business and improving the business with software, operate? Well, they don't think on a large project they don't think on a large project timeline where they're thinking about specifying a lot of things up front, and then 6 or 12 months later, they release that software to production. Instead, they go through what I think of as the small batch loop, which is a very fast cycle that relies on putting code into production as quickly as possible and observing if it actually helps users out and helps the business out or not. So what you do is, when you're coming up with a feature that you would like to have in your software, which hopefully directly facilitates or embodies your business, if you will, you come up with a theory of what that should look like. You write the code for it. You deploy it on a weekly basis. Again, it might be every 2 weeks or whatever makes sense, but you deploy it to production very rapidly. You observe if it's solving users' problems, if it's improving the situation, if it delivers on your idea, your theory of what this was going to do. And then if it did validate your assumptions and the feature works, you go and solve another problem. But you get a very valuable piece of feedback if it turns out it doesn't actually improve the customer's experience. It doesn't improve the business. You're given the chance to go back and try again because you're doing these short cycles instead of gigantic, large cycles. And this is the essence of what it means to think about software as a product instead of a project, right? You don't just deliver a project. You're constantly working on a product to constantly be improving it. So let me give you an example of what it means to think about your software as a product. And that's from one of our customers at Daimler. You might know them better as Mercedes. But they have a team there that we've worked with that's in charge of the front end for browsing and buying cars. So it's a search engine that you go to and you can search by attributes of the car. You can even build out your own car. Well, the team who was working on this, they were curious. So they were looking through the search records of what people were searching for. Because they wanted to improve the product. And they found that people kept searching for these Sprinter vans, not just cars, sedans and other things like that. But they were searching for these vans that normally just professionals like plumbers or ice cream salespeople or whatnot would drive around. Now, they didn't get good results for these Sprinter vans because that was a completely separate part of the business. And they had their own front end for searching through things, their own way of operating. But the team, in seeing these search results, they had a theory that it wasn't only plumbers and ice cream salespeople who wanted to buy these vans. It was regular people like you and me. So they came up with a theory that if they integrated results for sprinters into the search results and put it through the same workflow that consumers rather than professionals would buy, then that would make the customers' lives better and improve the business. Now, sure enough, when they put that experiment into production, following that small batch loop of coming up with a theory, deploying it to production, observing if it actually met the sort of metrics that they had, if people ended up configuring and buying these vans, they found that yes, people were interested in this. So they validated this assumption. Because it turns out that, like the Kinesis here, who got a Sprinter and kind of custom fitted it out for a 2-month trip around the northern part of the U.S., there were plenty of people who wanted to buy these who weren't plumbers or ice cream salespeople. Now, to me, this is a great example of how thinking about software as a product, going through a small batch process really is effective. Not only does it allow you to come up with features that work better and help customers in your software rapidly, but it allows you to start fundamentally changing the business, right? So these previous 2 lines of businesses now realize that they could do things in a new way. They opened up new revenue. So now let's look at what the teams working on these applications look like. When an organization has improved how it's doing software, how do they organize their developers? Well, the first thing is it's not only developers. What they do is they set up what I like to think of as product teams. You might call it a balance team or just the team. And this team owns that product, that piece of software. So instead of owning just one part of an application, they own as much of that product as possible, that process from an end user standpoint. And by ownership, what I largely mean is they're the ones in charge of it. They're autonomous enough to think about what to do, to think about, if you remember the Daimler example, integrating in search results for the vans. They tend to be curious and innovative, right? So they're always looking to improve how things are working. And they're very product focused in that they own this product, not just their one little deliverable. So in order to achieve that, you have a team that's not only software developers, but that also has designers. Not only who are choosing, whether you have a serif or a sans serif type, or there's a drop shadow on buttons or not. They do that. But a lot more of what they focus on is what the users are thinking and how they're operating, the workflows that people are going through, how to better do industrial design of the software, if you will, to make the software really work out the best for the user. Now you have another role that is not very common in most enterprise software, which is the product manager, which is very different than a project manager. Now the product manager is, you can think of them sort of as the general manager of the product. Their goal is to make sure that every single release, they're actually improving the value of that application. They're making their customers' experiences better. They're bringing value that works out well for the business, that achieves the business goals. And the way that they do this largely is they prioritize what features go out in each release. They prioritize the backlog. And that's a relatively simple task, but it really drives what's in the software. It starts to create the nature of the software. So how do organizations get to the point where they can deliver their software on a weekly basis, right? So if we have a notion of a product-driven way of doing software, so you can constantly be discovering and doing your software better, if you remember back to those sad donuts, there's a lot of things in the way. There's a lot of bottlenecks and wait time and slowdowns. So what organizations do, what I've observed pretty much all of them do as they're trying to modernize their approach to software, is they spend a considerable amount of time drawing out every single thing that happens in their software supply chain. Now, one way to go through this exercise is to think about, if I just wanted to deploy one line of code, from just saying I wanted to deploy that one line of code, to writing that one line of code, to verifying it, to packaging it, to planning to deploy it to production, to deploying it to production, to make sure that it's working, and then sort of verifying that everything's fine, what are all the activities I would have to do? How long would that take? And don't just think about the ideal state. Think about how long it would take you to open tickets, how long it would take you to schedule a meeting with someone, who you need to get approval from, how long the testing phases work, and on and on and on, right? And then you can also think about, what happens if I need to upgrade that? What James likes to think of as the one-factor app, right? Like, what does it take just to redeploy an application? Now, the importance of this is what you do with it, right? So once you've figured out what your actual factory for getting software out the door is, what your factory for improving the business is, you ruthlessly go through there and start to find things that are waste, that can be automated, that can be removed, that can be sped up. And doing that is really the essence of how you buy yourself the time, how you create the time to focus on that product cycle every week as you go through the small batch process. Now, we at VMware with the Tanzu stack, that's a huge amount of what we do, is we help you automate and improve and remove waste from this process by using the Tanzu application service, the Tanzu Kubernetes grid, the Tanzu build service, and all sorts of frameworks, largely in the Spring world, but also in the .NET world and other places, that really think about how do we remove waste from that process, and again, allow the developers, the product teams, to focus on their application instead of all this infrastructure stuff underneath here. Let's talk briefly about resistance to changing how you do things. There's a lot to be said there, which I've written about in books that I have, all sorts of tactics. But I want to look at three things that unify together that I think provide a way of trying to get over resistance to change, or put in a positive way, are what you generally go through to change. So the first important thing is to sort of lower your ambitions about how big you want to start, how much of a splash you want to make. Now, sometimes you can do everything at once and do large, important changes. Some companies are able to do this, but more than likely, and companies that I've observed, they take a more measured approach. They realize that they'll be changing a lot of the way that they're operating. They'll be changing their technology stack. A lot of large changes will be occurring. So what they want to do is they start small. They pick a few initial projects and they go through them to learn the new way of doing things. They figure out what the stacks are. They figure out what it means to do software as a product instead of as a project. And also what they're doing is they're picking actual user-facing applications. Things like billing portals, maybe in the case of Orange in France. Store finders are another popular thing. Or in-store apps used at Dick's Sporting Goods and Kohl's and other places. Or it might be things in more industrial companies like scheduling line workers to go out and repair things and check on lines, like in the case of Duke Energy. But you pick a series of these small, actual business-facing projects, and you slowly ramp up as you learn more and more, and you have more and more people experience with this. So this is generally the approach that I see people following, and you can see one example of it at the Home Depot, a hardware store or DIY store in the States that early on followed this practice and now has been able to ramp up to many more applications. Another thing that large organizations do to put change in effect, to transform, and that helps get over people who are resistant to it, is they focus a lot on doing actual projects. So instead of spending a lot of time planning and analyzing and having a big bang approach where then they roll it out to all projects at once, they start with one or two projects and they have a team there that learns and becomes successful. And then what they might do is they take those learnings and they add that other team on, and they might even take staff from those initial teams and use them to seed additional the new teams that they have. Now the effect that this has is that it allows a very grassroots sort of spread. It allows people to, in a kind of bottoms-up way, start to change the way the organization works. Now, also what you see very commonly is a very diligently nurtured community of practice or sort of education process going on. What's important in these communities of practice is that management has put in place the expectations and the time that people will actually share this knowledge with each other. So the key thing here is to think about, how can I get those initial projects? How can I use them to win initial success, train people up, and start to seed those people into new projects and start to seed those new applications into new portfolios so that we start to change the way that we're doing things by actually putting successful projects in place, which all depends on starting small. The other effect that this has is that you start to build up trust within the organization. You start to be able to internally market that the new way of doing things is effective, is even better because there's less weekend work and less rework and less drudgery in what you're doing, based on the actual experience of coworkers, instead of just a large analysis that you've done up front and rolled out all at once. Now, finally, when it comes to scaling up the change, right, to going from more than just a few initial projects that you were able to do on your own, and also, more importantly, winning over not only IT staff, but staff in your organization as a whole, you need to start building up trust with the business. Now, in the government, this may be the people running the agency, or a nonprofit, something else, but I'm just going to speak in terms of the business, which is ultimately the part of the organization that is relying on the software that you're doing to operate. We in IT have been trained over decades to speak in terms of performance. Things like uptime, the costs that we have, the speed at which requests are satisfied, things like that. But oftentimes, that doesn't mean very much to the business side of the house. What you want to do when you're winning over the business side is you want to think about what's important to them. How do I report on metrics and momentum that they care about? And you can see some of the metrics that organizations are reporting on that are successful, that are in high growth versus the underperforming organizations. And you can start to get a sense that metrics that these organizations are reporting on are more about things like customer retention, right? Reducing churn rate, or the feedback that they get from users, customer satisfaction. Now, you can also think about the actual strategies that you're trying to deliver on, right? So reducing call center volume to control costs and increase customer satisfaction is a very common business metric to think about. The time to complete a case request, whether it's a mortgage application or a government institution handling some sort of case request. And then, of course, there are things like revenue creation and times to start businesses, right? So think about how you communicate with the business about how what you're doing to improve the way that you do software is helping the business achieve those strategic goals, and report on that momentum, not just on your ability to keep IT up and running. Now, winning over the business is incredibly important for all sorts of difficulties you're going to have. One, if the business is actually rewarding the IT organization for doing software better and is asking IT to do more and is rewarding IT to do more, people in IT will see that doing things in this new method is better. And you'll often find that you can get over resistance and skepticism from internal people. Now, in addition to that, one of the common problems that organizations have who are trying to scale up transformation is budgeting problems. They just can't get a hold of the budget. They can't get enough budget, or they can't get it fast enough. And if you're showing that you're actually helping deliver revenue or deliver on strategic goals, budgeting is much, much less of a problem. Now, another thing that comes out as you mature is that you don't have enough involvement from the business. The business doesn't actually show up and start to get involved in the product process, which ultimately you need if you're going to start improving the way business operates. They need to show up and talk about what features would be good, what the market looks like. You really need that product involvement from the business side, not just doing things on your own in IT. So winning over the business side is incredibly important. And one of the chief ways to do that is to speak, as they say, in their language and report on metrics that reflect what their priorities are and what they care about. So let me provide you with one last example of one of our customers that brings a lot of this together. And again, that focuses on the thing that I always get most interested and excited about, and which is how are these product teams, how is software actually improving the business, not just satisfying it? So this is an example from Liberty Mutual, a large insurance company. They wanted to enter the Australian motorcycle insurance business, insuring people who are driving motorcycles. They didn't have a business in here, but because they were taking this product-oriented approach, and because they had the Tanzu stack, reducing all of that waste and automating so much stuff in their software supply chain, what they were able to do is launch a brand new business within 6 months. Now, there was more than just software involved in that, clearly. But within 6 months, because they could get that software out rapidly, they were able to start a brand new business and start bringing revenue in from virtually nothing. Now think about that right there. We often talk about time to market and how often and how quickly we can release software, but we very rarely talk about how quickly we can start a brand new business and start bringing money in. Now, 6 months is astonishingly fast, especially for an insurance company. And it's really by following this product-oriented approach to doing things, having a stack like Tanzu in place to remove so much of that waste, that led them to not only be able to start this business up rapidly, but really start to ratchet down and optimize the whole process, making it take a lot less time to do intake and sign someone up and get them to be a customer. And this resulted in them doubling the average sales rate, as you can see here, of the policies that they had. So this is really the kind of results that I think is fully possible for you to expect if you take the time to think about how you modernize your approach to software. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to check in on all of this. As I mentioned a few times, I have a couple of books available for free, thanks to VMware, that go over all of this in a lot more detail and many more topics and tactics that I didn't have time to cover. You can get them at cote.pizza, which is just an easier to remember domain name than a longer one. It'll just forward you to a place where you can get those books for free.